Today, we're launching a groundbreaking video called the COVID-19 Chronicles. As you'll see, during lockdown, we have been zooming around the world. And I'm delighted to say that the Royal Patron of the Wolf Institute, Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, has kindly agreed to introduce this video. Your Royal Highness.
Thank you, Ed. I'm pleased to see how the Institute has adapted so nimbly to new ways of working. As patron of the Wolf Institute, an organisation which seeks to foster understanding between religion and society through education, I'm pleased to launch this unique video compilation of insights from across the world about the effects of COVID-19 on communities. Over 50 religious leaders and scholars have contributed to the series, discussing areas of connection and contention, from South Africa to India, from China to the Americas. People are thinking about what community means and how to improve the way they live their lives, and so are we. The common denominators, like families, food, and faith, can bring us together, but equally they can all be defined slightly differently. This needs to be understood and accepted. The series provides insights into the ways in which particularly diverse communities across the UK and around the globe are coping with COVID-19. It demonstrates the strength of people's adaptability, perseverance, and sense of community in the UK and around the world. The pandemic has changed everyone's lives. The more we can find out about each other, the more we can help each other. The work undertaken by the Wolf Institute, of which this video is one example, will help foster understanding and tolerance and build bridges between communities. Well, back to you, Ed. Could you tell us something about how this compilation video of the series has been put together?
Thank you, Your Royal Highness. From the 57 interviews we have recorded all over the world, and which you can find on our website, we have picked extracts that tell a compelling and ultimately positive story about this pandemic. The structure of our story is a simple one, and it's borrowed from Dante's masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. Part one is Hell, in which the contributors reflect on the gravity of the crisis and on their grief. Part two is Purgatory, in which religious leaders and others start thinking about living with the virus and coming to terms with new practices. And part three is Heaven, in which we explore the potential spiritual benefits of the crisis and the opportunities for social change that it has thrown up. We begin in Jerusalem. Where else? With Catholic priest Father David Neuhaus, superior of the Jesuit order in that holy city.
So I think that the coronavirus has pushed us to think very, very carefully and deeply about what is our role as religious leaders. We are in a very big crisis, as you know, all over the world, because our church life is so much dependent on the physical presence of the faithful in church to participate in the sacramental life of the church. And this has got me personally thinking, and I think many, many of my colleagues thinking as well, what is our role in such a situation? It's almost apocalyptic.
The Gion Festival in Kyoto, which is one of the most famous ancient festivals in Japan, has cancelled the parade. Ironically, the origin of this festival is believed to be people praying for the end of an epidemic during the Heian period in Japan over around 1100 years ago.
I think for all of us in this generation, and I suspect you have to pretty much head back into the medieval times of plague, for most of us, this is an entirely new experience. We've, in a sense, churches have have tended to be places that have remained open even in the times of the greatest national crisis.
The high point of this was, and I'm talking about probably 10 people dying in the space of just a few days. And that's just the high point, because there's more than that. But Bishop T.A. McCullough, who is my spiritual father from I was in my teens, to this day I regard him as that. And he died in that. My good friend Fabian Anderson died. And my good friend Horatio Ferron died. My good friend Colleen Lang died. And then her mother died. Now, within my own church, which is a reflection of the Pentecostal community, is a wide variety of understandings of God. One of my favorite theologians say that we should embrace the God we find, not the God we wish, not the God we wish for. And, somebody said to me just today that we just have to keep on praying and hope that God will step in and say enough. And the cynical side of George said, yes, well, he didn't step in during 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm not quite sure what incentive you would have for stepping in now. So there's that bit of saying, where is God? Where is God?
This crisis has made a lot of people think about what it means to be human, about one's mortality, about the meaning of life, about hubris of humanity, of thinking that we have it all sorted. And suddenly we see it comes a little virus which we can't even see, and we can't deal with it, that humanity is under threat.
And COVID is affecting people disproportionately according to class, ethnic background, race. And there are a disproportionate amount of minority people, either immigrants or not, who are working on the front line and therefore are more likely to get COVID. Their poverty levels are greater.
Some of my members of congregation, taxi drivers, my congregation consists of a large number of taxi drivers, laborers, takeaway and restaurant workers. For them, of course, it's devastating because, and they're not still sure whether they would be paid or not. So there is uncertainties and difficulties.
So we do live in close-knit, dense communities. And when the dentist there got coronavirus, the boys here at the end of the road was on isolation because the whole of the football team was affected because the dentist did. So we're that kind of community. And of course, Muslim communities are the same from that point of view, more than Christian communities. But we know that from particularly the Ted Cantle charts in the Casey review, where we have very highly populated Muslim areas and Jewish areas. So I think that's what's going on, let alone we also have the question around Haredi communities, strictly Orthodox communities, or radically Orthodox, I think is probably a better description, fundamentalists, who were together at the Jewish festival of Purim when they shouldn't have been. And there have been numerous funerals and weddings of large gatherings, and that has had its knock-on effect, unfortunately.
From the beginning, they were a little bit slower in accepting social distancing guidelines, which did create a little bit of tension between the ultra-Orthodox community, if you can even call it a community. I would say ultra-Orthodox men and women to make it more simple, and everyone else. There's been a lot of different reasons to why that was so. But what I find interesting is that on the one hand, there's something very basic and human about everyone just trying to be safe and trying to be healthy. But these types of moments also, I would say, make pre-existing tensions come to the fore as well.
Yesterday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I did a funeral for a member of my congregation, an elderly lady in her early 70s again. She died with COVID, but she had diabetes, and and that was very surreal. I mean, and I've been doing funerals. My funerals are usually between 100 to 800, 900 to 1,000. that is, you know, I think I've never had one less than 100, really. And this one was only, you know, 10 people. And the undertaker, you know, was wearing the white personal protected suit. It looked really surreal, and everybody was standing 2 meters away, and you know, it was just like one of those horror films being played, you know.
Funerals are large community events within the Muslim community, and invariably you can have hundreds and thousands indeed attend funerals. And it's you know, the saying within the Muslim community is, if you get invited to a wedding, it's okay if you don't turn up, but even if you don't get an invite, you must all turn up to a funeral. You know, and it's that sense that it's a big part of what the community does. You know, it says it's goodbye. And now with the number of people being restricted at funerals to 6 or 8 or 10, I think the guidance has been different in different spaces. That's been really difficult, because that means even your nearest and dearest, your closest family and siblings and children can't attend. And so one of the things that I saw, which I thought was beautiful, was that an amazing community guy from West Yorkshire passed away not so long ago, and the way they dealt with him was that they that as they drove to the graveyard, they drove through all the kind of local streets, and people just came out onto the road. Everybody was socially distancing, but just came out to the front of their gardens and just you know, stood in silence. And it was a really, really moving moment of being allowed to pay your respects during these difficult times in an alternative way.
The sort of the central Chabad community in Crown Heights in Brooklyn have been particularly affected by coronavirus, as many in New York. New York City, New York State is very badly affected as an epicenter. And so many people who I'm familiar with, thank God no one particularly close, have been very sick, and some have passed. And it's been quite a traumatic experience in sort of, you know, logging onto the community websites and just to find out who's the latest people who are unwell. And, you know, I've been watching funerals over Zoom or on YouTube. The way that they've been doing the funerals has been driving through the community, and people come out onto their doorsteps.
Let's leave Rabbi Reuven Lee glued to his Zoom funerals and move out of hell into a section we've called Purgatory. Now, Purgatory could be subtitled Living with the Virus. And we start with His Royal Highness Prince Hassan of Jordan speaking to us from Amman.
So we see the world through plague eyes now, through the prism of borders, rather than through the prism of a call for a humanitarian order. But in terms of religions, I would assume that we all share in the value of the 4 tenets of the Holy Quran, which are, of course, justice, benevolence, wisdom, and compassion. So how do we institutionalize compassion?
It's interesting when it comes to Lagos in particular. I think that highlighting the religious leaders is actually essential, because I was reading an article recently about how, yes, medical infrastructures and hospital facilities are testing to the extent that they can and trying to comfort individuals as much as possible. But in many ways, religious leaders are also doing their bit. They're promoting their own sermons that have to do with God protecting and the divine providence and things of that nature, which also brings up interesting considerations about the kind of juxtaposition of religion and science in Nigeria. I would say in Nigeria, there is a growing fear simply because the health care mechanisms, the infrastructure is not in place in Nigeria. It doesn't exist.
I think what was quite interesting was that there are lots of Muslim doctors, lots of them. And so actually they kind of seem to get involved as well and say, look, from a medical perspective, from an NHS perspective, it's crucial that we all cooperate with this and, you know, try and somehow make this work, difficult as it is. So I think that was an interesting sort of crossover for me with people who know what the medical position is, saying to people who otherwise are trying to navigate these sometimes difficult community spaces, we really have no choice. It's not safe anymore.
And those conversations that I had with some of the mosque committees and religious leaders were difficult, because you were effectively, they were arguing from a theological perspective about how places of worship should remain open, how at times of anxiety, the mosque needs to be an integral part of community, how people need to have a place to come and worship and soul seek and seek comfort. And yet we were telling them exactly the opposite. So we were almost kind of arguing in different ways. And I remember this conversation with one religious leader who said, you have to understand, we also are like the ICU for people's faith and souls. And to try and explain how I understood the sentiment of that, but the practical application of that meant that actually there would be more people in the real ICU, and how that would impact on communities were difficult conversations.
By and large, what would happen is, as the male members of the family go off to the mosque, the women would just pray by themselves. By the time we return home, they've done their prayers and they're back to whatever it is that they have to do. And so we don't share any spiritual time, so to speak, together as one single unit, a family unit. And I think in some ways I see this as perhaps one of the small blessings we can see in this horrendous situation that has taken so many lives.
And of course, I'm being a Muslim woman from a very conservative part of that area, from Mardan and Swat. We've been working very hard to bring in reform and to help people understand and become much more aware through education and through courses which have a spiritual side. And some of the courses that I have been able to teach have been, for example, the Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks's book in Lahore, which is fantastic because sometimes people could misinterpret that, but it's been a wonderful bridge building and again, peace building courses. So something like that needs to be done, where you encourage global citizens and help change mindsets.
I mean, I couldn't resist when we first realized the mosques were going to close. I couldn't resist putting on my own social media, maybe we as women tell the men in our families that there isn't enough space for them to pray in the home, and see what the reaction is. I didn't want to belittle what is a very serious situation, but I just wanted people to think about it in a way that maybe they hadn't up to now, particularly men who are used to just going to the mosque, doing their prayers, coming home, and never really having to think about what the situation is maybe for others. So I couldn't resist that at the beginning, and so I did talk about that a bit, and it got a very good, very funny reaction by many people actually, which was really great to see that.
We also have chosen women to give the Friday messages, and that's been really wonderful. Their voices have been heard. They've been playing a very important role in the home in terms of leading certain areas of the prayers and so on, which has been very, very, very encouraging. And the other empowering thing is that people have had to learn to do these things themselves. So what we as imams and religious ministers have done is to provide some guidelines as to how these things should be done and so on. But then people have developed their own ways of implementing them in their homes.
The Muslim community is under the spotlight. President Trump has not been particularly kind to it. There's a Muslim ban in place. He very often makes remarks about Muslims which are sort of negative. But then there's also the remarks and the negativity around other communities. Just literally 2 or 3 days ago at the briefing at the White House, President Trump singled out a Chinese American and was quite rude to her. And when she asked, why are you asking me this question? He said, ask China this question about the coronavirus. He's been calling it the Chinese virus. So that creates a kind of focus on the Chinese, and there have been attacks on the Chinese. Early on, as you know, he had called Mexicans murderers and rapists. So because of that, the spotlight is not only on Muslims.
And frankly, I think the challenge to churches like ours is, what do we do when things are opened up a bit about communion? you know, when we have the unleavened bread and the wine, but you know, it's always been a symbol to share the one cup. Well, I don't think that'll ever be back. So there have been tensions in other areas of the United States. I'm not aware so much in New York City, between people who are demanding that religious services be able to be held, that the government cannot infringe on our liberties in this way. I think this is a very unfortunate and needless tension in the time of a pandemic, but nonetheless, these tensions are rife in certain areas of the United States.
On the negative side, we all know the story. You know, there's a political component to the conflict that is exploited and used in different ways by the different parties. However, I think on the religious side and on the communal side, there are a number of positive lessons here or experiences that we've had since March. You know, in about mid-March was when the first kind of lockdown situation started. Early on, there were decisions by the Israeli authorities to close down, you know, to shut down the area of the compound of, you know, the Haram Temple Mount. Initially, the Waqf, the Islamic, you know, authorities resisted that and had the sort of position that these were motivated by other, you know, considerations, especially since the other side of the gate, the Mughrabi gate, that's controlled by the Israeli authorities, had not been shut down initially. However, after literally a few days, so by before the end of March, the position of the Waqf had changed and they were strictly enforcing the full closure. And I think that was partly motivated by the fact that they saw that the Israeli authorities were applying the same stringent measures on the Jewish sites.
I mean, what I would say is that I'm not happy that the ultra-Orthodox community was scapegoated during the pandemic, but the thing that I am happy for, I would say, is that I do not see that the pandemic created more tensions between Israeli and Palestinian people in Israel, which, you know, it's sometimes easier to report when there's horrific news. But I'd like to report, you know, from being here, even though I'm supposed to be in Cambridge at this moment, is that I do not see more division between Israeli and Palestinian people in the Israeli society, which I find quite heartwarming. There's something about a pandemic that really can offer a new start in different aspects of life.
Of course, we know from our scripture, and I believe the same is for other major religions, whenever we are afflicted in some way or another, we tend to prolong our worship, like our, you know, rituals, the prayers that we perform, the supplications that we make to God. We tend to do them really well when there are difficult times around us, like in times of crisis, or when a calamity befalls on us, or an affliction befalls on us. Yeah, I wear this flower to remember the people of Srebrenica, basically to remember any innocent victim of you know, a horrible war conflict. I would really say it's like that. You know, it's not just Srebrenica, it's not just the Holocaust, I would say. So, you know, this kind of flower is supposed to spread the message of peace and reconciliation, basically. So I would say, yes, to be honest with you, war is a much tougher situation. Yes, we are afraid of this current virus, but this is not like a war state. You are not really afraid of bullets, you know, hitting you, or shells dropping, you know, at your front door and potentially harming you or any of your family members. So we are being careful not to catch this difficult disease, but at the same time, we know that people are not aiming at us.
So the impact of the pandemic cuts right across every aspect of society and inevitably hits the poorest the hardest. From the point of view of the Catholic Church around the world, it's obviously impacted and continues to do so on the outward observance of our faith. Now, some of that has been illustrated, as you mentioned earlier, by that rather remarkable moment of prayer that Pope Francis held in a deserted St. Peter's Square in the rain.
I don't know if you were able to watch at the end of March, I think on the 27th of March, there was this beautiful, also very eerie prayer where he was alone on St. Peter's Square. And I remember a Jewish friend of mine who's from Rome. So for Jews in Rome, it's also their Pope in a certain way. A Jewish friend of mine called me saying, "What did he just do? That was so powerful. Was it some kind of invocation against the pandemic?" And I said, well, it wasn't presented that way, but there is a spiritual struggle going on.
Churches can be slow with that whole innovation thing. And this has forced the pace. I think another thing it's done is it's helped us embrace technology. I think often we've been perhaps skeptical or suspicious about technology, about social media. Now, most of us in churches, we are generating prayers and sermons and Bible readings and acts of worship online all the time.
But I think that it's opening up avenues of communication, types of communication that might be pastorally useful. People who don't come to church, but now can tune in, can get a chance to express themselves, can receive some kind of nourishment from religious leaders over the social media.
For example, in our church service yesterday, rather to everyone's surprise, we had somebody joining us from Japan. There was a remote personal connection there, and he decided he and his family would simply join in. And that was a connection we had no idea of until at the end of the service, this little Japanese voice came online and said, "Hello, I'm speaking to you from Japan."
The world's Muslims being the Ummah, meaning one community of believers in Islam. And the way the faith has been structured from its inception is designed in a way that whether you are in physical contact or you are thousands of miles apart, you do feel that connection, you do feel that oneness, that you are all one together. So if we look at the 5 daily prayers, many of our scholars say that when the call to prayer starts off in the Fiji Islands and finishes off in the far west coast of America, for example, almost every hour, or at least every half an hour, even every minute, there is a call to prayer being made somewhere on this planet. And that's what connects us as an ummah. If you look at the fast, we will all begin the fast at dawn and end the fast when the sun sets. At that moment, you feel that connectedness, that we may be all by ourselves now in our family home, not in the mosque with communal iftar and breaking of the fast and other places. So that idea of belonging to the ummah, I think will still remain very much alive. And I think now it is felt even more powerfully because it is a distant belonging to the ummah.
I suppose a challenge like this and a pandemic and the degree to which we understand our inextricable interconnectedness and our vulnerability at the same time leads us perhaps to have a better perspective on life and to get our priorities a little bit better in order, but above all, to develop our sense of gratitude and appreciation. And of course, Maimonides, as you know well, says you cannot fulfill that commandment to know and love God without studying science and being aware, therefore, of the physical world and of its scientific realities. Perhaps there is a possibility here that science and religion, which the Western world has tended to portray in some kind of adversarial manner, can be better appreciated as complementary and mutually supportive as a result of a crisis like this.
I think that you build community online by allowing interaction, that you have to find space for feedback and to hear voices. So it's taking it out of that moment of the service and allowing space for personal conversation. So things like having a service backed up with the tea in the afternoon, where those people who have access to the service can come and tell you what they like, to meet other people face to face in a more intimate setting. So using Zoom to have a discussion forum really, really helps. So, for example, even we put on a hot potatoes, so a discussion on a really interesting, controversial topic. The last one was on, actually, is COVID-19 a plague? But then the discussions that happened afterwards in our daily tea allowed us to know what worked then, what didn't, and adapt it for the next time.
Technology is a great blessing and a great gift from God, and something that we should celebrate. But at the same time, it has shown its limitations, that however constructive and however helpful the technology is, which it is not the same as real human contact. It is lacking a very fundamental element that human beings require to be in the company of others.
Rabbi Herschel Gluck's insight leads us from purgatory into heaven, where spiritual insight and societal change await. At least we hope so. And we begin with Lord Richard Harries, former Bishop of Oxford, with his striking vision of a sort of digital paradise.
Nevertheless, there is this remarkable digital community now, which making us feel that we do belong together, we're doing things together. And if one can be a bit mystical about it, it's the Christian people throughout the world and those who rejoice with us, but on another shore, on a greater light, the whole sort of communion of Christians on earth and heaven, united in this invisible kind of way. So that, and the implications of that are, well, how will this change our practice when all this is over? I think it will.
Whoever knew that Zoom would be such a blessed thing for us? I don't think any of us ever thought that. And people who set it up in the first place probably never imagined that it would be used in the way that it has been now.
And so it's created an opportunity for people on the edges who might be interested in more spiritual exploration to just pop in, and for that to be at a very low threshold, for them to start seeking out some of these different spiritual services that they might not have done so otherwise. So we've actually noticed greater generational diversity. We've noticed greater geographical diversity. We have people from New York and Kansas and Florida and Minnesota and Texas who are all attending our services here in California.
And as a Christian, of course, we have that deep stream of sacramental theology that says stuff matters. You know, people present, bread, wine, oil, water, fire, those things are ways in which God reaches us. And I think to sort of make everything as virtual as possible might be to lose, and we're discovering that, I think. We're discovering that however useful Zoom is, we're missing hugging our friends and being with them and being around a table with a bottle of wine with them. And it's the same in our faith. We need that immediacy.
What we will, when we come out of this, I think we will see how valuable that is, that experience of being next to somebody, being near to somebody, you know, the touch, the smell, you know, the sounds, and they're really, I think, important part of our humanity.
I hope another COVID-19 doesn't come in a hurry, but I have to say that if God means anything to us, that God has got to be bigger than euphoria. God has got to be bigger than life itself, and that God has to be one that is with us in life and in death and able to help us to translate how we move between those two things.
And now we're seeing a move for both Muslims and Jews in the work that I've done with New Ground to step forward into the space of looking out for our Asian American brothers and sisters who have been targeted through the racist kind of language and approach and fear that's emerged out of COVID.
But what I am seeing is that the young generation, this is my students today rather than 20 years ago, they're very committed to the idea of an open, inclusive America. And I think they're taking the brunt of what is happening. And in that, remarkably, Muslims do better because there's a sense of stability and continuity at the home. They have something to grasp, something to hold on to. And it's a time when leaders like you have to be showing people, ordinary people, what is happening, how to move ahead in terms of reflection, meditation, in terms of going into themselves and looking for support from family, from friends, finding some space within yourself to, as it were, hold on to your inner self. Reading your favorite books, laughter, music, your favorite music. I think these lessons are equally important, because all the time we hear in the media, the economy, the economy, the economy, and that of course only takes you to a certain point and then leaves you alone, leaves your finger, as it were, and you're left alone. So it's critical that guides, the spiritual leaders, as it were, help us through this very difficult time.
It's a very particular situation in Egypt because we have so many generational gaps in terms of like the way people will view the government, for example, or like what they may have expected the response to be based on previous experience. So when the response was, we'll like shut things down, we'll give people masks in the subway, we'll like do different things to kind of like slow it down and like do our best. And despite it not being 100% perfect, of course nothing is, there has been a visible response. It's kind of a lot better than maybe we would have gone in the middle of the chaos in the revolution, for example. So like there's all this like historical memory of being let down, and now we weren't. So even people that I know personally that were in the revolution, that were solidly anti-government, right now we're like, okay, we didn't expect this, but it's great. So it's kind of a very positive outcome, in my opinion. But of course, people can refute it.
The pandemic has in fact laid bare, it has made manifest, revealed the kind of structural violence, you know, in the society in which we live. In fact, you know, how poorer people have been impacted more, you know, devastatingly by this pandemic. Now, are we going to go back, or the damage that we did to the environment? Are we going to go back to what we call normal, or are we going to really use this opportunity of reflection to fashion a more compassionate and a just world order?
There's one very special person I'd like to quote at the end of our conversation, and his name is Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai. Now, he's a very special Sufi saint and poet, and he wrote a magnus opus, a beautiful book called the Shah Jo Risalo. Eden, I'd love you to teach that at the Wolf Institute. It's a very fat book, and it's based on many stories, on about 7 stories, and these are called the 7 Queens of Sindh. Now, Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai is known as the Shakespeare of Sindh, and his stories are all in the voices of women. So the woman is the protagonist, and through her story, we understand how to reach out to humanity, regardless of faith, regardless of barriers and boundaries. And it's all about, again, compassion, empathy, and universal idea of love for humanity and love for the divine.
Now that we know how, you know, fractious our society can become, and how painful it can be to be separated from one another, when we don't choose to be, but when we are sort of forced to be, how can we make sure that when we reunite with intention?
COVID has given us an opportunity. It has also led to some significant challenges. On the issue of environment, I do want to highlight that one of the key priorities remains rainforests, because that's the lungs of our planet. The way that our forests are being threatened is very similar to the impact of COVID on us, because threatening the forest and removing it is effectively like us burning our lungs and not having proper lung capacity, which is what COVID is doing to our bodies. So it's an irony that these things are happening simultaneously.
If you think of a barren landscape in which miraculously, a limestone landscape, in which somewhat miraculously flowers bloom, then you know there's a deep down underground stream from which they're drawing water. And every now and then on a limestone landscape, that stream bursts out and there's a wonderful waterfall, and then it disappears again. We're in one of those moments when we suddenly see the goodness and we search for its source. And its source, I do believe, is in belief in God, in belief in life as a gift, a gift that is shared, a gift that is given that we may be of service to each other, and a gift which is ultimately purposeful.
The Wolf Institute, improving relations between religion and society through education. The full collection of interviews for the COVID-19 Chronicles can be found on our website at www.wolf.cam.ac.uk/videos.